Joe, thanks very much indeed. It's been a while since I was able to interview you, but you're in Blighty. You're in London for the Julian Assange hearings. Give us, please, some of the flavour of that.
Hello, George. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just a few blocks from the Royal Courts of Justice in a hotel here. It was a bizarre 2 days, kind of delusory world of the United States and the construction of a kind of fake world that we see imposed on the world, and too many people go along with it. And we saw that in the courtroom where they describe investigative journalism, standard practices of journalism happening every day as espionage and as a unique threat to national security, and how this journalist, Julian Assange, was actually not a journalist, but he was endangering informants' lives, and on and on and on, just exactly what's in that indictment. And the problem is that this was his last gasp. Back in 2020, there was an extradition treaty. Of course, Julian was arrested on 2019 in April, charged with espionage for publishing secrets, government secrets, not only of the United States, but many governments around the world, exposing crimes. And he was arrested for that. One of his lawyers made it very clear that there is a nexus between the publication of those documents and his persecution, that there was a timeline that shows the motives of the United States. It was really quite interesting how he laid this out. For 6 years, there was no prosecution of Julian Assange. These documents that he's been charged with were published in 2010. They were also published by Le Monde, Der Spiegel, El País, The Guardian, and the New York Times. At that time, Joe Biden, who was vice president, was asked on Meet the Press, a U.S. talk show, whether they were going to go after Julian Assange. He said, we can't prosecute him if we can't prove that we got him red-handed stealing these government documents. If he passively received them as a journalist, there's nothing we could do. Well, the Obama administration didn't indict him because they couldn't catch him red-handed. And even though they don't call him a journalist, they knew that he was acting as one. But 6 years later, something happened. The International Criminal Court decided to, this is according to Julian Assange's lawyer, Mark Summers, the ICC decided to look into Afghanistan and maybe actually even prosecute the United States for war crimes in Afghanistan, and partly based on WikiLeaks releases. Suddenly they were attacked. American officials started attacking Julian Assange. And then when the 2017 Vault 7 leaks came out, which exposing CIA spying tools, Mike Pompeo, in his first public appearance, the CIA director, went after him very strongly and called him a non-hostile, non-state intelligence service, which was a legal term which allowed the CIA to then use any operations they wanted without oversight from Congress. And as we know, they actually had plans that Donald Trump asked for and Mike Pompeo drew up to either kill or rendition Julian Assange. And then they didn't know where to put him. So the White House lawyers thought this was going too far. You better come up with an indictment. That's the reason he was indicted, George. And he then went on extradition hearing in 2020. He won. The judge, Vanessa Barreza, the magistrate judge, said that his mental health conditions, his suicidal tendencies, and the condition of U.S. prisons meant he should not be extradited to the U.S. The U.S. then appealed that to the High Court with some after-the-fact assurances saying, we'll treat him well. He won't be. He'll get medical care and won't go into a dungeon. And the High Court accepted that. They didn't challenge the diagnosis, his health diagnosis. They just said the U.S., they believed the U.S., that they would take care of him. When Assange wanted them to appeal that to the UK Supreme Court, the Supreme Court did not take the case. Now they're trying to appeal it one last time at the High Court, and a High Court judge rejected last June their appeal on many, many points of law. And what we saw yesterday and today, Tuesday and Wednesday this week, George, was an appeal about an appeal. The Assange lawyers now are trying to get 2 new High Court judges to agree to have an appeal. To actually, what we saw was a dry run these 2 days, a kind of mini appeal. So we went over all the issues, and I think these 2 judges were quite surprised at things that they heard. I don't think they were very well versed in the Assange case. They did stick, unfortunately, to some of these myths, really, that part of this grand deception that Assange was an hurting informants, that he didn't redact the names from the documents. That they kept asking about, but they also had some intelligent questions, which makes me believe that they're going to give the appeal, but it won't happen, I believe, until after November. We won't get a decision about what happened these 2 days until after the election, because the last thing Joe Biden needs is a journalist in chains showing up on the American shores during a presidential campaign where Donald Trump would certainly make something out of that, because he's the one who's responsible for Assange's indictments. I'm not talking of anything good about him in terms of Assange, but his supporters, many of them are libertarians. They care not only about the Second, but also the First Amendment. So he would make something out of that. I don't think we're going to get anything till November. And I do think that, I believe from what I saw, that there would be. And I was inside the courtroom, sitting between the bench and the lawyers behind me. I think that in a very small courtroom, courtroom 5, that they're going to allow this appeal.
Now, Joe, one of the things that strikes me as you adumbrate the chronology of all of this is how grossly disproportionate it all is. I mean, what a waste of time and money and a man's life over stories. Yesterday's fish and chip paper from 2010, almost 15 years ago. A 15-year epic saga over a set of stories that are now accepted everywhere as fact. Everybody knows about American crimes in Abu Ghraib, in the war logs, in the conduct of the occupation of Afghanistan, and so on. Everybody kind of knows that and has banked that or discounted that. And yet, the US juggernaut keeps on coming for Julian. Why do you think?
They can't let anybody else do what he's done. This was something they never expected, that a new form of journalism, almost analogous to Gutenberg and the printing press, using the internet to put out raw documents, hanging the US by their own words and other governments. And this is something they can't allow to happen again. And they're making, obviously, an example of him, and they want vengeance. And when I say they, I mean basically the Central Intelligence Agency, who we know was actually considered seriously killing him, poisoning him, or kidnapping him and renditioning back to the U.S. from the embassy of Ecuador here in London, where he lived for 7 years. So they have to get him. They're just mad. They're mad. They want revenge. They cannot be treated like this by someone with a computer and was able to expose their dirty secrets. This is really it. This is and one of Mark Summers, again, one of Assange's lawyers, pointed out in his presentation and his submissions that the U.S. is acting like any authoritarian regime would treat any dissident journalist who exposed their secret crimes, and that the U.S. side never wants to talk about what's in the documents. And he making this clear. This has to be talked about. And there's a lot of issues. The death penalty is still not off the table here. This became a big issue over the last 2 days because under the Espionage Act, in a time of war, they could put a death penalty there. Now, that's highly unlikely, it seems. However, the U.S. refuses to give assurances. I should say the Home Secretary refuses to ask the U.S. for assurances, which in extradition cases to countries where there is the death penalty is a routine matter for a British Home Secretary, because under the law and under the extradition treaty the U.S. has with Britain, and what Britain has with other countries, if the person sought could get the death penalty, Britain doesn't send that person there. Why won't they ask the U.S. to give an assurance? So this is chilling. Again, probably won't happen. The First Amendment, he's going to be denied the right of the First Amendment, which is a violation under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the equivalent of the U.S. First Amendment. There are many, many of these points of law that we discussed, that were discussed in the court, that Assange is, he's even if he, George, even if he gets this hearing, he's going to stay in Belmarsh prison, having already served his bail jumping charge. He's been 4 years since then without any conviction, and they're going to keep him there at least another year or more, probably, because of this appeal that he wants to have. So maybe they are already getting the punishment that they've sought. They can't let this guy get away with it. They want to make a huge example of him. That's just the way it is, unfortunately.
You think, though, Joe, that they've really had their pound of flesh. I mean, how much do you want? The guy's done effectively done 15 years of incarceration for writing journalism. It's, as I said at the beginning, is grossly disproportionate, isn't it?
Yes, and I think more and more the world is waking up to that. We've seen many press freedom and human rights groups now, including Amnesty, who are not stepping up for him. We have presidents, 4 or 5 presidents of Latin American countries, asking for Joe Biden to drop this charge. We have the Australian Parliament passing a resolution about 10 days ago, demanding that the U.S. drop this case. You know, Biden will often say, and it was repeated by Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, that the U.S. can't, the White House can't interfere with the Justice Department because there's a Chinese wall there. It's political and it has to stay out of the meeting justice cannot be. And yet we saw, George, this story where the prosecutor who interviewed Biden to see whether he would charge him for having classified documents at home,
Exactly.
instead put out, he said, no, the guy can't even remember when he was vice president, so we're not going to be able to charge him. Well, you know that the White House lawyers were so furious before that came out, they kept sending letters to the Department of Justice saying, do not put that out. So, of course, they'll interfere in the DOJ when it's in their own interest and not for Julian Assange.
Joe Lauria, as always, a master at work. Thank you very much indeed. Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News. A must read if you're interested in international affairs.